May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Betrayal. It's the thin line between protection and deception. What you've heard today is the story of a teacher who crossed that line. I'm George Sink Jr., along with my co-counsel Brittany Sutton. We represent the state. We're here to represent the victim, Michael Yanati, who trusted his teacher, who looked up to him. And on Friday of Martin Luther King,
you represent the state of Carolina.
Yes, Your Honor. We represent the state, and on behalf of the victim, we seek justice. Now, in representing the state, we've identified this teacher to whom little 12-year-old Michael Yanati looked up. This trust was built up. And on Friday of Martin Luther King Day, little Michael Yanati was taken by the defendant without knowledge of his mother. And you heard from the defendant, he didn't tell anyone where this boy was taken. Taken to a house, locked inside, yelled at, being called an ungrateful little bastard, intimidated, until the boy finally escaped, running home to his mother at 4 a.m. She hears 4:30 a.m., the worst moment of her life, as her child stands before her in tears, frightened, scared. We're here to help make sure that never happens again, and that this wolf in sheep's clothing, this defendant, is found guilty of kidnapping. Now, we're the state in this case, and what that means is we bear the burden of proving what we say, the charge, beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. What it means is simply that once you've heard all the evidence, the testimony, you've reviewed everything and applied common sense, that the only logical conclusion is that the defendant is guilty. The judge will give you the law, and it's a long law full of a lot of jargon. But here are the three things that really we're alleging as part of that law, and we ask you to apply the facts to this. We only have to determine whether the defendant, one, enticed the boy into his home with these promises of gifts, of games, of fun. Whether the boy was carried away from school by the defendant, and you've heard the defendant say that happened, and whether the defendant was whether the boy, the victim, 12-year-old Michael Yanati, was confined within the defendant's house. Now, the prosecution only has to prove one of these to prove kidnapping. That's carried away from the school, enticed into the basement, or confined without the mother's permission. That's all that's required to prove, all we're required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It's important to note that intent is not a part of this. It's sort of like possession of an illicit substance. It doesn't matter whether you were just holding it for a friend. If you've got it, if you meet these elements, you must find the defendant guilty. So let's talk about each one of these elements. Carried away. Well, you heard the defendant. He says he carried the boy from school to home. He told you that he never contacted the mother. In fact, we never got a proof that he contacted anyone. Now, the defendant claims that he called the mother all weekend, diligently. But did anyone see any proof of that? Wouldn't he have offered that if that were the case? On the other hand, you've heard from Pat Yanati. She said she didn't receive a single call. This boy was carried from school to a basement, and no one told the mother where he was. Therefore, the defendant could not possibly have given her consent. And that is one way to prove kidnapping. If you find that the defendant carried the boy away without approval of Pat Yanati, then you must find the defendant guilty of kidnapping. Now, second, enticement. If you wonder what enticement looks like, here it is. Stand-up video arcade games for free for a child. You've got 2 Xboxes, a large screen TV, fantasy characters. Everything a little boy would want. In fact, you heard from Michael's testimony. This was every kid's dream. You heard from the principal that the defendant learns what each little boy likes or dislikes. And he set up something perfect for Michael. Knows he loves Star Wars and soccer. Tries to make the boy feel comfortable. He invites him over in late night emails to come to his house repeatedly. Imagine that. 47-year-old man sitting alone at night after 11 p.m., writing a 12-year-old boy, I wish you could come to my house. I wish we could celebrate here. I have all these great games and toys. That's enticement. An enticement without the consent of the mother constitutes kidnapping. If you find that occurred, you must find the defendant guilty. Now, third, confinement. That's a third way to prove kidnapping. You heard from Michael. He was locked in a basement. He couldn't escape. You heard from the detective. The detective states that the doors could only be locked from the outside. Not only could they be locked from the outside, but there was no other way to escape. That's confinement. The moment that lock clicked shut and Michael couldn't get out, that's confinement. The moment the boy felt he wasn't free to leave because the defendant came up and said, "You ungrateful little bastard," and he felt he couldn't escape past the defendant, that's confinement. If you find the defendant confined, the little boy, Michael Yanati, without consent of the mother, that's kidnapping. Again, as the state, we don't have to prove all three of these things. Any one is sufficient to put the defendant away and keep the rest of the children of this community safe. Now, I want you to remember a few things as you go into deliberations. First of all, this man presents himself as a teacher, as a trusted figure, a soccer coach. But parents are calling him weird. They're noticing that this behavior he exhibits towards children is a little off. Michael was one of the few who resisted coming to this man's house. It had been just a long winter break since the coach was unable to get Michael over to his house. He finally saw his opportunity as Michael sat out there waiting for his mother. The coach grabbed that opportunity, took the child in his van, drove him to his house, took care of him, tried to get him comfortable, then tucked him into bed, kissed him on the forehead, and then locked the door. Now, remember that. Doors that lock only from the outside. Remember that the testimony of the little boy was corroborated completely by the investigation of the detective, and corroborated largely by what the defendant says, that he took the boy, that they stayed together the amount of time. And remember that this was for 4 days and 3 nights. If this had been for a few hours, I'm not sure we'd be here. Maybe even overnight could be explained. But to take a child for 4 days and 3 nights without telling a parent where they are, without telling the principal where they are, without even driving by the child's house, well, that's kidnapping. That's unmistakable. We ask that after you review all of the evidence, all of the testimony, that you expose this wolf in sheep's clothing, take away this teacher's license to kidnap children, and find him guilty of kidnapping.